The August heat pressed against the windows of the old Victorian house in Richmond, Virginia, as Michael Torres climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. Dust particles danced in the shaft of afternoon light, cutting through the dimness. His grandmother had passed 3 months earlier, and the task of sorting through generations of accumulated belongings had finally brought him to this forgotten space. Michael was a high school history teacher, drawn to the past in ways his siblings never understood. While they had quickly claimed furniture and jewelry, he had volunteered for the attic, knowing that the real treasures of a family's story often hid in the least convenient places. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, their contents labeled in his grandmother's careful handwriting. Christmas decorations, father's war letters, kitchen linens. But it was a wooden trunk in the far corner, unlabeled and secured with a rusted latch, that caught his attention. The hinges protested as he lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowed newspaper from 1952, he found a large portrait frame. Michael carefully peeled away the brittle paper, revealing a formal family photograph. The image was remarkably well preserved, its sepia tones still rich and detailed. A family of 5 posed in a garden. The father stood tall and stern in a dark suit, his thick beard meticulously groomed. The mother sat in an ornate chair, her Victorian dress with its high collar and leg of mutton sleeves perfectly pressed. She cradled an infant while 2 young children, a boy of about 7 and a girl perhaps 5 years old, stood nearby in their Sunday finest. Michael recognized the house in the background immediately. It was this very house, though the garden had long since been paved over for a parking area. The wraparound porch looked identical, down to the decorative woodwork his grandmother had always insisted on maintaining. He turned the frame over, hoping for names or dates. A small label, handwritten in fading ink, read, "The Harrison Family, Summer 1898." Harrison had been his grandmother's maiden name. This portrait showed his great-great-grandparents, people he'd never known, never even seen photographs of until this moment. His pulse quickened with the thrill of discovery. These were his ancestors, frozen in time 126 years ago, their faces now emerging from obscurity to meet his gaze across more than a century. Michael carried the portrait downstairs to better light, already planning to have it professionally restored and framed for his living room. Michael set the portrait on the dining room table, angling it to catch the natural light from the bay window. He pulled out his phone and began taking photographs, wanting to capture the image before bringing it to a professional restorer. As he zoomed in on different sections, the father's stern face, the mother's gentle expression, the children's carefully combed hair, he noticed how remarkably sharp the photograph was for its age. The photographer had been skilled. Every detail stood out. The texture of the fabric, the individual leaves on the climbing roses behind them, even the grain of the wooden porch visible in the background. Michael had seen countless photographs from the 1890s in his years of teaching, and most were blurry or overexposed. This one was exceptional. He continued his digital survey of the image, documenting each family member. When he reached the left side of the frame, focusing on the house's exterior, something caught his eye. On the windowsill of what he knew was the parlor window, there sat a small object. Michael enlarged the image on his phone screen, his fingers pinching outward to zoom closer. The object became clearer. A round metal item, perhaps 3 inches in diameter, with something attached, a ribbon or fabric of some kind. The way the light hit it suggested a polished surface, maybe brass or bronze. His heart began to beat faster. He grabbed a magnifying glass from his grandmother's sewing kit and held it over the actual photograph. There it was, undeniable now. A medallion of some sort, circular and official-looking, with what appeared to be a faded red and white striped ribbon attached to it. But that made no sense. The Spanish-American War had occurred in 1898, the same year as this photograph. Had someone in the family served? Michael's great-great-grandfather stood in the portrait, clearly at home. The war had been brief, lasting only a few months. Could he have served and returned by summer's end? Michael pulled out his laptop and began searching military records. The surname Harrison was common, making the search difficult. He needed more information, first names, unit designations, anything that could narrow down the search. He stared at the medallion in the photograph, a tiny detail that most people would never notice, yet it nagged at him with the persistence of an unanswered question. The next morning, Michael arrived at the Virginia Historical Society before it opened. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with possibilities about the medallion. The building's classical facade gleamed in the early sunlight as he waited on the steps, the portrait carefully wrapped in acid-free paper under his arm. Dr. Patricia Henley, the chief archivist, unlocked the door at precisely 9 o'clock. Michael had worked with her before on various research projects for his students, and she greeted him with warm familiarity. "Michael, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said, ushering him inside. "Maybe I have," he replied, unwrapping the portrait on her examination table. I found this in my grandmother's attic yesterday. It's my family, the Harrison line, from 1898. Patricia leaned over the photograph, her practiced eye taking in the details. Beautiful preservation. The photographer knew what he was doing. Is this the house on Grove Avenue? The same one. But look here. Michael pointed to the windowsill. There's a medallion. I think it might be military. Patricia retrieved a professional-grade magnifying loupe and examined the detail closely. Her expression shifted from casual interest to focused concentration. She straightened up, meeting Michael's eyes with a look of surprise. That's definitely a military medallion. The ribbon pattern suggests Spanish-American War era. But Michael, there's something odd about this. What do you mean? The placement. It's sitting on a windowsill, displayed almost casually. Military medallions in 1898, especially those earned in combat, were treasured possessions. They weren't left on windowsills. They were kept in presentation cases or worn on formal occasions. She paused, studying the photograph again. And there's another thing. Your great-great-grandfather is clearly in this photo at home. If this medallion belonged to him, why isn't he wearing it? Men of that era would have worn their military honors in a formal portrait. Michael felt a chill despite the warm room. So if it wasn't his, then whose was it? Patricia finished. And why was it there, in that specific place, on that specific day? She pulled out a reference book on military decorations and began flipping through pages. We need to identify the exact type of medallion. If we can do that, we might be able to trace its origin. Patricia suggested they examine census records and city directories from 1898. Within an hour, they had pulled up the digital archives on her computer. The 1900 census, the closest available record, showed the household composition clearly. Here we are, Patricia said, highlighting the entry. Thomas Harrison, head of household, age 34, occupation, banker. Margaret Harrison, wife, age 29. Then the children. Robert, 7, Elizabeth, 5, and infant William. She scrolled down to the additional columns. And look at this. 1 live-in domestic servant. Michael leaned closer to the screen. The entry read, Clara, female, black, age 28, occupation, nurse, housekeeper. No last name was recorded, a common practice for domestic servants in that era. The dehumanizing incompleteness of the record struck Michael with uncomfortable force. This woman had lived in his family's home, cared for his ancestors' children, yet history had reduced her to a single name. A nurse, Michael said quietly. She would have been in the house that day, probably nearby when this photo was taken. Patricia was already pulling up city directories. Richmond directories from this period sometimes listed servants separately. Let's see if we can find more. She worked methodically, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Here, 1898, Richmond City Directory, Colored Residence section. The directories of that era were segregated, listing black residents separately. Patricia navigated to the H section, then scrolled slowly. Nothing under Harrison household. Wait. She stopped. Look at this. Under separate residence listings, Clara Johnson, nurse, residing 412 Grove Avenue. That's the house address, Michael said, his excitement building. She was significant enough to be listed separately, not just as household staff. Patricia made notes on a pad. Clara Johnson. That's a start. Now we need to figure out why a nurse and housekeeper would have a military medallion from 1898, and why it would appear, however accidentally, in your family's portrait. Michael stared at the name, Clara Johnson. After 126 years, she was beginning to emerge from the shadows of history. But what was her story? And what had she done to earn military recognition in an era when black women were systematically excluded from official recognition? Dr. Henley contacted a colleague at the National Museum of American History, Dr. Raymond Chen, a specialist in Spanish-American War militaria. She emailed him high-resolution scans of the portrait, specifically focusing on the medallion detail. His response came within 3 hours. Michael was still at the archives going through additional records when Patricia's computer chimed. She opened the email and read aloud. Patricia, the medallion in your photograph is remarkable. Based on the ribbon's striping pattern and the visible shape, I'm confident this is a meritorious service medallion, issued briefly in 1898 to military medical personnel who served during the Spanish-American War. These were unofficial commendations, created by field commanders to recognize exceptional service, particularly among nurses and medical staff who weren't eligible for standard military decorations. Fewer than 200 were ever issued, and most have been lost to history. If you can authenticate this and trace its recipient, you've found something quite significant. The fact that this woman appears to have been a black nurse makes it even more extraordinary. Their contributions were almost entirely undocumented. Patricia and Michael locked eyes. The pieces were beginning to fit together in an almost unbelievable pattern. Clara Johnson was a war nurse, Michael said slowly, testing the words. She served in 1898, received this medallion, then came to work for my family afterward. Not just a war nurse, Patricia corrected, a black war nurse, in an era when such service was systematically denied recognition. Michael, women like her were essential to the war effort. They nursed soldiers through yellow fever, typhoid, battle wounds, but the military didn't officially acknowledge them. They were hired as contract workers, not enlisted personnel. They received pay, but no rank, no official status, no veteran benefits. Michael felt the weight of this revelation settling over him. His family had employed a woman who had served her country courageously, who had earned recognition through a rare field commendation, yet she'd returned to a society that offered her only domestic work. And his family, his ancestors standing so proudly in that photograph, had they known? Had they cared? We need to find out more about her, Michael said. Where she served, what she did, what happened to her afterward. Patricia was already typing. The War Department kept some records of contract medical workers. They're incomplete, but they exist. Let's see what we can find. The National Archives search took 2 days. Patricia filed an official research request, and Michael spent the waiting time teaching his classes while his mind remained fixed on Clara Johnson. He found himself looking at the portrait constantly, wondering if she had been nearby when it was taken, perhaps watching from a window, her medallion forgotten on the sill in the rush of preparing the family for their photograph. When the records arrived, Patricia called Michael immediately. He left school during his planning period and drove straight to the archives. The file was thin, just 8 pages of water-stained documents. But it was enough. Clara Johnson, born approximately 1870 in Richmond, Virginia. Hired as a contract nurse by the Army Medical Department in May 1898. Assigned to the field hospital in Santiago, Cuba. Service period, May 15, 1898 to September 30, 1898. One page contained a handwritten report from a Major William Thornton, the medical officer in charge of her unit. Nurse Johnson demonstrated exceptional courage and skill during the height of the yellow fever outbreak in July. While others fled the contagion, she remained at her post, working 18-hour days to care for afflicted soldiers. Her actions directly saved numerous lives. I have issued her a meritorious service medallion in recognition, though official channels do not permit formal commendation for contract personnel. She is a credit to her profession and her country. Michael's hands trembled as he read the words. This woman, reduced to a single name in census records, employed in his family's home as a servant, had been a hero. She had faced death repeatedly, had worked herself to exhaustion saving soldiers' lives, had been brave when others ran away. There's more, Patricia said gently. She pointed to another document, a discharge paper. She received her final payment on September 30th, 1898 in Richmond. She was back home by October. And by the following summer, she was working for my family, Michael said. Why? Why would a woman with her skills and courage end up as a domestic servant? Patricia's expression was sad but knowing. Because that's all society offered her. Black nurses weren't hired by hospitals. Private medical practices wouldn't employ them. The skills she'd gained, the courage she'd shown, none of it mattered when she came home. She needed work, and domestic service was one of the few options available. Michael became consumed with finding out more about Clara. He spent evenings after school and entire weekends researching. Patricia helped him navigate databases, taught him to read old city directories and church records. They discovered that Clara had worked for the Harrison household for 6 years, from 1898 to 1904. She appeared in census records, city directories, and briefly in a church registry, Mother Bethel AME Church on Clay Street, where she was listed as a member. She left in 1904, Patricia noted, comparing directory listings. The 1904 directory shows her living at a different address, 325 Jackson Ward. That was the heart of Richmond's black community at the time. Michael found property records showing that Clara had purchased a small house at that address in March 1904. She'd saved enough from her wages to buy property, a remarkable achievement for a black woman in that era. But then the trail went cold. Clara's name disappeared from city directories after 1910. No death certificate could be found in Richmond records. No further property transactions. Nothing. She may have moved, Patricia suggested, or married and changed her name. Without more details, it's nearly impossible to trace. Michael felt frustrated. He'd come so far, learned so much about this woman who'd lived in his family's house, cared for his ancestors' children, but her story seemed to end in silence, the way so many stories of Black Americans from that era simply vanished from the historical record. Then, Patricia had an idea. Church records? If she was a member of Mother Bethel AME, they might have more comprehensive records than the city directories. Churches kept detailed membership lists, including marriages, deaths, relocations. They visited Mother Bethel the following Saturday. The church was still standing, a beautiful brick building that had served Richmond's Black community for over 150 years. The pastor, Reverend James Mitchell, welcomed them into the church office and listened to their story with growing interest. "Clara Johnson," he repeated thoughtfully. "Let me check our historical archives. We've been digitizing old records." He disappeared into a back room and returned 20 minutes later carrying a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed but legible. "Found her," he said with a smile, "and I think you're going to want to see this." The church ledger revealed that Clara Johnson had married in 1911 to a man named Samuel Green, a schoolteacher in Jackson Ward. Her entry included a note, "Relocated to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 1912." But most importantly, it listed her children. Daughter Ruth, born 1913, son Samuel Jr., born 1916. "She had family," Michael said, his voice catching with emotion. "She didn't just disappear, she built a life." Reverend Mitchell made copies of the relevant pages. If she moved to Philadelphia, there might be church records there too. The Great Migration was just beginning. Many of our congregation members headed north for better opportunities. Back at home, Michael began searching Philadelphia records. He found Ruth Green's birth certificate, then her marriage record from 1935. She'd married a man named Thomas Wright, Samuel Green Jr. His trail was harder to follow, but eventually Michael found his death certificate from 1982. Ruth Wright's record led to her children, then grandchildren. And then, late one evening as Michael searched Facebook pages and genealogy websites, he found her, Vanessa Wright, age 43, living in Philadelphia, describing herself as a community health worker and amateur genealogist. Her profile included a post from 2 years earlier, "Researching my great-grandmother Clara Johnson Green." Family stories say she was a nurse during the Spanish-American War, but I've never been able to confirm it. If anyone has information about Black nurses who served in 1898, please contact me. Michael's hands shook as he typed a message. "Dear Miss Wright, my name is Michael Torres. I'm a history teacher in Richmond, Virginia, and I believe I have information about your great-grandmother Clara Johnson. She worked for my family in 1898 and appears in a family portrait. But more importantly, I found her military service records. She was indeed a war nurse, and she was a hero. I would very much like to speak with you about her story." He hit send and sat back, his heart pounding. Somewhere across the miles, Clara's descendant was about to learn the truth about her ancestors' courage and sacrifice. The response came within an hour. "I'll drive down tomorrow. I need to hear everything." Vanessa Wright arrived at Michael's house on Sunday morning, a tall woman with her great-grandmother's determined bearing evident in the set of her shoulders. She carried a worn photo album and a folder of documents. Michael had the portrait set up in his living room, along with all the records he and Patricia had gathered. As Vanessa approached the photograph, her eyes welled with tears. "That house," she said. "My great-grandmother worked there." "She did more than work there," Michael replied gently. "She saved lives in Cuba before she ever set foot in this house. Look, here on the windowsill." He showed her the medallion, then guided her through everything they'd discovered. The service record, Major Thornton's commendation, the 6 years she'd spent with the Harrison family, her eventual move to Jackson Ward and later to Philadelphia. Vanessa listened, occasionally wiping her eyes. When Michael finished, she opened her own folder. "My great-grandmother kept a diary," she said. "Just a small one, and she didn't write in it often. But there are entries from 1898. She pulled out careful photocopies. "I never understood them before. Listen to this one from October 1898. I am home now. The work I did seems like a dream, both terrible and beautiful. I saw boys die calling for their mothers. I held their hands and prayed with them. Major Thornton gave me a medallion, but I cannot wear it where anyone would see. It would only bring questions I am not permitted to answer, so I keep it safe, a reminder of what I know myself to be, even if the world will not acknowledge it." Michael felt his throat tighten. She couldn't even talk about her service. "No," Vanessa said. "Black women who'd served were told to keep quiet. The military didn't want to acknowledge they'd relied on Black nurses, and Southern society certainly didn't want to hear about Black women's heroism." She turned another page. "Here's another entry from June 1899. right around the time this photo was probably taken. The Harrison children are sweet. Little Elizabeth asks me to tell her stories. I tell her about Cuba, but I change the details. Make it about a place I visited, not a war I fought in. She listens with wide eyes. Sometimes I wonder if anyone will ever know the truth. Vanessa looked up at Michael. She was there that day, probably inside the house, caring for the baby or preparing lunch. And her medallion was on that windowsill. Maybe she'd been polishing it, remembering who she'd been before domestic service was her only option. Michael and Vanessa spent hours talking, sharing documents and stories, piecing together Clara's full life. They learned she'd continued nursing informally in Philadelphia, caring for sick neighbors in her community, though no hospital would hire her. She'd raised her children to value education and service. She'd lived to see her daughter become a teacher and her son graduate from college. Clara had died in 1956 at age 86, surrounded by family. Her obituary in the Philadelphia Tribune made no mention of her military service. That part of her story had been buried for nearly 60 years. "What do we do now?" Vanessa asked. "How do we make sure people know what she did?" Michael had been thinking about this since finding the medallion. "I teach history," he said, "and I've been teaching it wrong, teaching the official version, the one that leaves out people like your great-grandmother. I want to change that." Together they developed a plan. Michael would create a curriculum unit about Black nurses in the Spanish-American War, using Clara's story as the centerpiece. Vanessa would share her great-grandmother's diary entries and family photographs. They would present their findings at a local history conference and submit an article to a historical journal. But first, they wanted to do something more personal. The following Saturday, they gathered at Mother Bethel AME Church with Reverend Mitchell, Patricia Henley, Dr. Chen from the museum, and Vanessa's family members who'd driven down from Philadelphia. Michael brought the portrait, now professionally restored and framed. Reverend Mitchell spoke about Clara's life, her courage, her quiet strength in the face of systematic erasure. Vanessa read from her great-grandmother's diary. Dr. Chen explained the significance of the Meritorious Service Medallion and what Clara's documented service meant for understanding the fuller history of the war. Michael stood before them all, holding the portrait. "This photograph was taken 126 years ago," he said. "For all that time, it hung in my grandmother's attic, and no one noticed the small detail that told a hidden story. Clara Johnson Green served her country bravely, saved lives, earned recognition, and then came home to a world that refused to acknowledge what she'd done. She worked for my family for 6 years, caring for children, keeping house, living a life that must have felt impossibly small compared to what she'd accomplished in Cuba." He paused, looking at Vanessa. "But she built a family. She raised children who valued service and education, and she left behind a descendant who refused to let her story be forgotten." Vanessa came forward, and Michael presented her with the portrait. "This belongs with your family now," he said. "It's part of Clara's story, proof that she was there, that she existed, that her sacrifices mattered." As Vanessa accepted the portrait, holding it carefully in her hands, her eyes traced the image of the house, the garden, the formal family, and finally, the small medallion on the windowsill, a tiny detail that had survived 126 years to tell the truth. Clara Johnson Green's story was finally being told.